The summer sun baked the dust of the frontier town until it shimmered like fire, and yet the crowd still gathered, drawn by something darker than heat. They stood around the iron cage in the middle of the street, their faces half hidden under hats, their whispers sharp as knives. Inside the cage sat a man unlike any other in those parts, broad-shouldered, silent, and marked by the deep bronze of the desert. His long braids hung heavy over his chest, his hands chained though he barely moved. The sign above the cage read, $10 to touch the beast. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with both fear and fascination. Men spat tobacco into the dirt, pretending not to care but lingering just the same. The caged Apache had been brought in 2 weeks earlier by a bounty hunter with a broken arm and a bruised face. Nobody asked how it happened. They only saw what the bounty hunter dragged behind his horse, a legend in flesh. Beaten and bloodied, a man said to have once led raids that turned entire camps to ash. Now he was nothing more than a sideshow. The sheriff claimed keeping him caged was mercy, that it stopped more blood from being spilled. Others said it was justice, and a few called it entertainment. But whatever they called it, nobody dared go too close. Nobody except the 2 small boys who had crept near the cage that morning, their bare feet stirring the dust. They whispered something the Apache didn't seem to hear until one of them reached through the bars, offering a crust of bread. The man looked up then slowly, like an animal remembering what sunlight felt like. His eyes were deep, quiet, and unbroken. He took the bread without a word, and that was when the pregnant widow saw him. She had been walking from the church, her dark hair braided tight against the wind, her hand resting over the round curve of her belly. She didn't plan to stop, but when her gaze met the Apache's, her steps faltered. The whole town had told her not to look at him, not to speak of him, not to let her mind wander toward the man who once burned soldiers' camps to the ground. Yet in that still moment the world around her went quiet. She saw not a beast, but a man caged in shame, stripped of everything but pride. The shopkeeper's wife noticed and hissed through her teeth, "Keep walking, dear, or folks will start to talk." The widow didn't answer. She only stared at the cage, at the 2 boys who knelt by the bars, and at the man who guarded them with a stillness that didn't belong to the beaten. The sign above him creaked in the wind, $10 to touch the beast. Rumor said no one who had tried it lasted more than a breath. The first was a drunken rancher who bragged that he'd slapped the Apache's face for the crowd's amusement. The man had reached his hand in end before the sheriff could blink. The rancher was on the ground, his wrist bent backward, and his pride shattered. After that, most just came to stare. The widow's house stood at the edge of town, near the cottonwoods by the river. Her husband had died the winter before, taken by fever before he ever saw the child she now carried. Since then, she had spoken little, lived quietly, and earned her bread sewing clothes for the very soldiers who once hunted the Apache. She didn't look for trouble, and yet trouble seemed to follow her gaze that day. As the sun began to sink, painting the dust red and gold, she returned to the square again. The crowd was thinning now, though the sheriff and 2 guards still watched the cage. The Apache sat unmoving, the boys asleep against his knees. The widow stopped a few paces away, her hand trembling as she held out a small tin cup of water. The sheriff caught her wrist. "Don't," he warned. "That one doesn't drink from white hands." She looked at him, her voice quiet but steady. "He looks thirsty. He's a killer," the sheriff said. "Then let God decide that," she replied, and slipped past him before he could stop her. When she set the cup near the bars, the Apache lifted his eyes again. They weren't the eyes of a savage or a beast. They were tired, steady, and strangely calm. He didn't reach for the cup, but the smallest of the boys stirred, blinking awake, and took it for him.
No.
The man drank then, slow and measured, never breaking her gaze. The crowd had gone silent by then, the air thick with the kind of tension that makes even the wind hold its breath. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Lady," he said, "you best go home before folks get the wrong idea." But she didn't move. "Da-da-da-da." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "What's his name?" The sheriff frowned. "That doesn't matter. He won't live long enough for you to remember it." She looked at the man again. His silence was heavier than words, but there was something in it that reached her deeper than any name could. She didn't know why she felt drawn to him only, that something inside her couldn't walk away. That night, she dreamed of the cage, of iron bars, and a man whose eyes carried both sorrow and storms. She woke before dawn, her heart racing, her husband's wedding ring pressed tight in her palm. By morning, the town buzzed with new gossip. The traveling showman who owned the cage had decided to move on to take the Apache to the next town where curiosity was worth more coin. $10 to touch the beast had become a business. When the widow stepped out into the street, the sun barely touched the rooftops. The cage was still there, the Apache already bound for transport. The two boys huddled beside him again, their faces streaked with dust and fear. The sheriff was counting money in his hands. She walked straight toward them, her steps sure despite the weight in her belly. The sheriff looked up, startled. "Ma'am, this ain't your concern." She stopped in front of the cage. Her voice trembled once, but not from fear. "How much?" The sheriff blinked. "What are you asking?" She lifted her hand, the gold band catching the morning light. "For the man? How much to buy him?" The crowd, small as it was, froze in stunned silence. The sheriff stared at her as if she had spoken madness itself. "You can't buy him," he said slowly. "He's property of the showman." "Then ask him," she replied. "Tell him I'll trade this." The showman laughed, a sharp, greedy sound. "Lady, that ring won't buy you his chains, much less his life." But she didn't lower her hand. Her eyes never left the man in the cage. "It's all I have," she said softly, "and I think he's worth it." The laughter around her died one voice at a time. Even the sheriff had no words. The Apache looked up then, his gaze locking with hers once more. Something flickered behind his stillness, something fierce and human that no chain could bury. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, rough, and filled with a quiet strength. "You don't know what you're asking." The widow's fingers tightened around the ring. "Maybe not," she said, "but I know what I'm offering." The air between them burned with a strange kind of silence, the kind that comes before something changes forever. And as the morning winds stirred the dust around their feet, the cage door creaked. The sheriff's hand hesitated near his gun, and the widow took a single step closer, her heart pounding louder than the crowd's whisper. That was the moment everything began to shift. The day the town saw not a beast behind bars, but a woman who dared to see the man within. The sheriff's hand hovered over his belt, torn between law and disbelief. No one in town had ever seen a woman stand up for a caged Apache, let alone one accused of killing soldiers. The widow's offer her wedding ring. The last trace of her husband hung in the air like a challenge to everything they believed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind stirred the dust, the cage creaked, and the Apache's gaze didn't waver from her face. It was a look that unsettled everyone watching. The showman finally broke the silence. "Lady," he said, stepping closer with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "you don't know what you're asking for. This man's worth more in fear than gold. You'd better keep that ring and walk home." But she didn't move. Her voice was calm, soft, but carried a kind of quiet fire. "I buried the man who gave me this ring. He fought for something he believed in. Maybe this one did too." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some muttered prayers. Others shook their heads. The sheriff took a step toward her, lowering his voice. "He ain't like your husband. He's killed folks. You try to take him, and you'll bring the whole town against you." She met his eyes with a steadiness that silenced him. "God, if he's truly a beast," she said, "then let mercy show what fear never could." Her words hung in the air long after she turned and walked away. That night the story spread like wildfire. In every saloon and corner of the dusty town, men spoke her name with disbelief. Some said she'd gone mad from grief. Others whispered she was bewitched by the Apache's stare. Few said she'd been guided by God. Whatever they believed. No one forgot the sight of her standing in front of that cage, holding her ring out like a promise. In her small cabin by the river, she sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the floorboards. The wind outside carried faint echoes of laughter from town, but she didn't hear them.
Ow.
Her thoughts were on the man behind bars the way he had spoken, not with anger, but with warning,
Ellie.
as if trying to protect her from something she couldn't yet see. She didn't know his story. No one did, not truly. The soldiers had their version, an Apache warrior who led attacks on supply wagons, who burned outposts and vanished into the desert. But the elders in the nearby camps told a different tale of a man who had lost his family to raids and had fought not for blood but for land and honor. Both stories ended the same way, with him captured, chained, and displayed for coin. By dawn, she couldn't sleep. She lit a lantern and stepped outside. The air was cold, the kind that bites through fabric and memory. Every step toward town felt heavier, but something inside her pushed forward a voice that wouldn't quiet. When she reached the main street, the showman's wagon was being loaded. The cage still sat on the platform, its bars glinting in the pale light. The Apache was awake, watching the horizon as if measuring the distance between freedom and fate. The two boys were huddled beside him, whispering softly in a language she couldn't understand. The showman saw her and scowled. "You again? I told you this ain't a charity." She reached into her apron and held out a small cloth pouch. The coins inside were dull, worn from years of saving. "Take this," she said. "It's all I have." He looked at her hand, then laughed. "Lady, you couldn't buy the chain around his wrist with that." "I'm not buying a chain," she said quietly. "I'm buying a man." The sheriff stepped out from behind the wagon. His hat shadowed his face, but his voice carried that same weary warning. "You're making a fool's bargain. You bring him home and you'll regret it." She looked at him. "You said mercy's not worth the trouble. Say it's the only thing that still means something." He sighed, rubbing his jaw, torn between his duty and something deeper that stirred when he saw the determination in her eyes. The town watched from their porches, pretending not to listen, but hearing every word. The showman finally shrugged. "Fine. You want him so bad? You take him. But if he runs, he's your problem. If he kills, it's on your head." Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the pouch in his palm. He counted the coins, sneered, then nodded toward the cage. "Unlock it." The sheriff hesitated. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," she said. The key turned, the lock clicked, and the sound seemed to echo across the empty street. The Apache didn't move at first. He just sat there, his dark eyes on her unreadable. The two boys clung to his arm. Slowly, he stood, his height casting a long shadow in the rising sun. The crowd held its breath. Some expected him to strike, to roar, to prove the story's true. But he didn't. He stepped out, silent, the chains clinking at his ankles. The widow took a step back, then another, unsure if she had done something brave or foolish. The sheriff tossed her a small knife. "Cut the chains if you dare," he said. Her hand shook as she knelt, sawing through the metal links until they snapped loose. The Apache flexed his wrists, the skin rubbed raw, then looked down at her. "Why?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard, because no one else would. He stared for a long time, then turned toward the open desert, as if testing the thought of escape. But instead of running, he looked back at the two boys and placed his hand on their heads. Then, without a word, he followed her. That walk back to the cabin felt like a dream. The few who watched them pass whispered behind closed doors. A widow leading a warrior through the dust, some said it was madness. Others said it was prophecy. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill. When they reached the cabin, she gestured for him to sit outside while she fetched water. He didn't enter. Instead, he sat beneath the cottonwood tree, eyes on the hills. The two boys played quietly in the dirt, drawing shapes only they understood. She brought out a bowl of stew, still warm, and placed it near him. "You're safe here," she said softly. He looked at her, then at the food, and finally spoke. "Safe is a word for those who have nothing left to lose." She didn't answer. His voice carried something heavy, something older than both of them. The wind rustled the leaves, and for a while, silence filled the space between them. Days passed, and the town's curiosity turned to unease. The sheriff visited more than once, warning her to keep an eye on her guest. Soldiers passing through would slow their horses near her gate, their eyes sharp with suspicion. But the widow said little, and the Apache never left her land. He chopped wood, repaired the fence, and kept watch from the ridge, as though expecting a storm that hadn't yet come. At night, she sometimes caught him staring at the stars, his lips moving in quiet words she couldn't understand. Once, she asked him what he said. "I speak to those who are gone," he told her, "so they don't forget me." Her heart ached at the sound of it. She knew what it meant to talk to ghosts, to feel the weight of promises made to the dead. And in that silent understanding, something began to shift between them, something fragile and unspoken. But peace was a stranger in those lands. One evening, a rider came from the east, carrying news that the army was searching for the escaped Apache. They'd heard whispers that a woman had taken him in. The sheriff rode to warn her, his face pale in the fading light. "They're coming," he said. "They won't ask questions." The Apache heard him from the porch and stood tall, his eyes narrowing. "Then I'll leave," he said simply. But the widow stepped forward. "No," she said. "You'll stay. You'll have to face me first." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You can't protect him. You'll lose everything." She looked past him to the horizon, where the sky burned red with the setting sun. "I already lost everything once," she whispered. "I won't again." The Apache turned toward her then, his expression unreadable, his silence heavy with meaning. The wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats across the valley, and as the night fell, shadows gathered at the edge of the land, carrying with them the promise of reckoning. The widow stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. Watching the dark figure beside her, the man the world called a beast stand, wondered if she had saved him or doomed them both. The night was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carried warning. The wind had stilled, the crickets had gone silent, and only the creak of the porch boards sounded beneath the Apache's weight. He stood watching the horizon, where a faint red glow marked the campfires of soldiers who were drawing closer. The widow sat inside by the small fire, her sewing untouched on her lap, her thoughts heavy and restless. Every sound outside made her heart jump. She knew the army would come eventually. She had known it the moment she offered her ring. Inside the cabin, the two boys slept near the hearth. Their soft breathing filled the space that had once felt too empty. Now it was full of life, but also of fear. She had taken in strangers before, runaways, widows, a wounded soldier once, but never anyone who brought the whole weight of the world's anger upon her door. Yet when she looked at him, sitting there in the moonlight, she didn't see danger. She saw a man carrying more sorrow than any cage could contain. The Apache turned when he heard the door creak. His gaze met hers in silence. "They're close," he said. His voice was low, steady. "You should take the children and go." She shook her head. "This is my home." "They'll burn it if they must," he said. "They'll call it justice." She looked down at her hands, the faint glint of the missing ring, leaving a pale mark on her finger.
"Oh, yes."
"They already took everything from me once," she whispered. "If they burn it again, at least I'll know I didn't stand aside this time." He didn't argue. He just watched her for a moment longer before turning back toward the hills. There was something in his stillness that made her ache, a kind of acceptance she couldn't understand. The next morning, the sheriff rode up before sunrise. His face was drawn, his voice tight. "They'll be here by noon," he said. "The captain's not the forgiving type. He's bringing 10 men in orders to take the Apache dead or alive." She nodded, her jaw set. "Then I'll speak to him." The sheriff frowned. "He won't listen. They say this man led an ambush 3 years back that killed the captain's brother." Her eyes flicked toward the porch where the Apache stood, unmoving. "And do you believe that?" The sheriff hesitated. "I believe people do desperate things in desperate times. And I believe you're about to make yours worse." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the morning light. The widow stepped outside. The Apache didn't move. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the horizon. Finally, he said, "The soldiers burned a village by the river. They said it was justice. Among the ashes, I found my wife and daughter." His words were calm, almost too calm. After that, I stopped counting what was right or wrong, only counted what was left. Her throat tightened. There were no words for that kind of loss. She wanted to reach for him, but something told her he wasn't asking for comfort. He was telling her what kind of man stood in her yard. Man hunted not for who he was, but for what grief had made him become. As the hours passed, the tension grew. The two boys, sensing the unease, stayed close to the cabin. They followed the widow as she packed a small bundle of food, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. The Apache helped her move the livestock into the back field, saying little. Every gesture between them carried weight, the unspoken understanding that this might be the last morning they shared. By midday, the first sound of hooves broke the silence. A cloud of dust rose from the road. Soldiers appeared, their uniforms sharp against the dry land. The captain rode at the front, a scar down his cheek and hatred burning in his eyes. He halted his horse near the gate and scanned the scene. The widow stood on the porch, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. "Captain," she said, "you're trespassing." He smirked. "You're harboring a murderer." "I'm harboring a man," she replied. The captain dismounted. "Step aside, ma'am. I'll not harm you or the children, but I can't promise the same for him." The Apache stood a few paces away, silent. The wind carried the faint jingle of his chains. He still wore part of one around his wrist, too stubborn or too proud to let it go. "He's not your enemy," she said firmly. "Killing him won't bring your brother back." The captain's expression hardened. "You think you know what it means to lose someone? You think a widow's pity changes what he's done?" She didn't flinch. "I think hatred blinds men faster than love ever could." For a moment, something flickered in the captain's eyes. Something human, but it vanished as quick as it came. He turned to his men. "Search the place." The soldiers moved forward. The two boys ran to the Apache, clutching his arm. The widow's heart pounded as one soldier shoved open the cabin door. Another started toward the barn. The Apache's muscles tensed, but he didn't move. His calm was the kind that frightened even those who thought they had power. The captain looked him over, his lip curling. "You killed my brother," he said. "I buried mine," the Apache answered. The captain drew his pistol, anger flaring hot. But before he could raise it, the widow stepped between them. Her voice broke, but didn't waver. "Enough. You'll have to shoot through me." The soldiers hesitated, unsure. The scene was too still, too charged. Even the horses pawed the ground, uneasy. The Apache spoke quietly then. "Let them take me." She turned on him, eyes wide. "No, it's me they want," he said. "If I stay, they'll burn this place and kill everyone inside." "I won't let them," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "You've already done enough." But before he could step forward, the youngest of the boys cried out, clutching the Apache's leg, "Don't go." The sound tore through the tension like a knife. For a brief second, the captain hesitated again, his jaw tightening. Then the sheriff appeared from the ridge, his rifle raised. "Nobody's dying today," he called. His horse came to a stop between the two sides. "Captain, you're out of your jurisdiction." "She's a citizen, and unless you've got a warrant, you'll leave her land." The captain's fury rose, but the sheriff's calm authority made him pause. The air was thick with threat. No one moved. Finally, the captain lowered his gun, but pointed it toward the Apache. "You can't hide forever," he said coldly. "When we come back, no sheriff will stop us." They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving behind a storm of dust and the promise of return. The widow watched them disappear until the last hoofbeat faded. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees. The Apache stood behind her, silent as always. But when she looked up, there was something different in his eyes, something like guilt. That night, the tension didn't fade. The sheriff stayed a while, warning her that the soldiers would return with reinforcements. "You can't fight the army," he said. "You've got to find a way out." The widow shook her head. "I can't run my whole life. I've done enough hiding." The sheriff sighed, then looked at the Apache. "You could leave. Take the boys, go south. I'll buy you time." The Apache didn't answer. He only looked toward the hills, the place where his people once lived. "There's nowhere left to go," he said. When the sheriff finally left, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The widow sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the floor. The Apache stood outside again, his figure outlined against the silver glow. The boys slept beside the fire, unaware of the weight that hung over the house. She wanted to tell him he could trust her, that she didn't regret freeing him. But she also saw the distance in his eyes, the part of him that still lived behind invisible bars. "Why didn't you run when you could?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "'Cause I don't run from what's already chasing me." There was a sadness in his tone that made her chest tighten. He wasn't talking about the soldiers. He was talking about ghosts, about the memories that followed him through every sunrise. She understood because her ghosts had followed her too. Rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the desert itself. The Apache lifted his head, listening. His jaw tightened. "They're not soldiers," he said. "They're scouts." Her pulse quickened. "Yours." He nodded slowly. "If they found me, so will the army." The truth hit her like a cold wave. It wasn't just one side that hunted him. It was both the soldiers who saw him as a killer and his own people who might see his capture as betrayal. The widow stepped closer, the firelight flickering across her face. "Then we face them all," she said quietly. He looked at her, truly looked, as if seeing her for the first time. And in that silent exchange, something bound them tighter than fear or blood, a shared understanding that neither of them could turn back now. The night stretched long, heavy with the promise of what dawn might bring. Somewhere beyond the hills, hoofbeats echoed again. The Apache's hand went to the knife at his side. The widow's fingers brushed the doorframe, steadying herself. Both knew the storm was only beginning. The next morning began with a silence that pressed against every wall. The air felt heavy, the kind that came before a storm. The widow stood at the window, her hand resting over her stomach, watching the sun creep over the hills. She could see the Apache down by the river, his figure still as stone. The boys were gathering sticks near him, laughing softly, unaware of the danger closing in from both sides. The night before had changed everything. Now the soldiers knew where he was, and somewhere in the distance, his own people had begun to circle back. The sheriff hadn't returned. The widow guessed he couldn't risk being caught between two fires. Still, she hoped he would. Every sound made her heart jump. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. She had always known this peace was fragile, but now she could feel it breaking like thin ice underfoot. When the Apache came back to the cabin, his steps were quiet, but his expression was tense. "Scouts were close last night," he said. "They didn't come near, but they watched." "Your people?" she asked. He nodded. "If they find me here, they won't understand. They'll see you as an enemy." She swallowed hard. "Then talk to them. Tell them the truth." He shook his head. "They won't listen. I think a man who's been caged has no honor left." The words cut through the room, leaving a silence that felt colder than the morning air. She wanted to say something, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was a quiet sadness there, something that told her he had already made peace with his own death. By midday, the heat rose thick and dry. Dust shimmered in the air as the wind carried distant echoes' hooves, faint and scattered. The Apache moved toward the barn, checking the rifle the sheriff had left behind. The widow followed him, her heart racing. "They're coming, aren't they?" she said. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at the horizon told her enough. The boys came running from the field, their small hands clutching wildflowers. "There's dust on the road," the older one said. "Lots of horses." The Apache crouched, his face calm even as his voice dropped low. "Go inside, stay quiet. Don't come out until I tell you." The widow grabbed his arm. "It's the soldiers. They'll kill you." He looked at her with the same quiet strength she'd seen the day she freed him. "They already did once," he said softly. "He just left the body breathing." The soldiers reached the edge of the property before sundown. The captain rode at the front again, his scar catching the light like a brand of vengeance. This time, he wasn't alone. There were twice as many men, rifles strapped and eyes hard. They spread out across the field, their horses kicking up clouds of dirt. The widow stepped onto the porch before they could call out. The captain's gaze met hers, cold and sharp. "Move aside," he said. "You had your warning." She stood her ground. "You won't find justice in killing him." "I'll find peace," the captain said. The Apache stepped from behind the barn, rifle in hand, his shadow stretching long in the dying light.
Ow.
The soldiers raised their guns instantly. The widow gasped, stepping between them again. "Don't!" she shouted. "He won't fight unless you make him." But the captain didn't lower his weapon. His jaw was tight, his voice steady. "You think he's changed? You think he's anything but what he was born to be?" The Apache's voice was calm. "I was born to protect what was mine. You took it. Now you come again." The words sent a tremor through the air. The soldiers shifted, fingers on triggers. The widow felt her pulse hammer in her ears. The boys were peeking through the window, their faces pale with fear. The tension snapped when one nervous soldier fired a shot into the ground by accident. The horses reared, the men shouted, and in that brief chaos, the Apache moved. He didn't shoot, but in one fluid motion he knocked the rifle from the captain's hand and sent it skidding into the dust. The captain stumbled back, his men circling to aim. "Stop!" the widow cried, her voice breaking through the noise. "Stop before you destroy everything left worth saving." But no one listened. The captain lunged for his pistol, rage in his eyes. The Apache stood still, his hands raised now, his calm returning even as the soldiers surrounded him. "If you kill me," he said, "my people will come for you. They won't stop." The captain froze, torn between fury and fear. The widow stepped forward again, her voice trembling. "And if you kill him, you'll prove every lie ever told about mercy. You'll be no better than the fire that took your brother." Her words hit him like a blow. His grip on the pistol faltered, but before he could answer, a sound rose from beyond the ridge, a wild, echoing cry that silenced everyone. It was a war call, distant but unmistakable. The soldiers turned their heads. The Apache looked toward the hills, his jaw tightening. "They're here." The captain's face drained of color. "Your people?" He nodded once. "You hunted me too long. Now they hunt you." The sound grew louder, drums beating faintly under the wind. Horses appeared on the distant ridge, their riders dark against the setting sun. The soldiers scrambled, forming a line, their fear barely hidden behind their orders. The widow grabbed the Apache's arm. "You can stop this," she said. "They'll listen to you." He shook his head slowly. "Not now. Blood calls to blood." "Then run," she said. "Take the boys, go through the canyon. I'll stay." He looked at her, startled. "No. You said they won't harm me," she pressed. "They'll see I'm not their enemy." He hesitated, torn between instinct and the fragile trust they had built. "If they touch you, they'll pay." "They won't," she said firmly. "Go." But he didn't move. Watched the oncoming riders with an expression that mixed pain and resolve. Then he took her hand, pressed it once, and turned toward the barn. The two boys ran to him, clinging to his legs, refusing to let go. "I'll come back," he told them softly. The widow led the children inside, closing the door just as the first arrow struck the dirt outside. The air filled with the thunder of hooves and gunfire. The ground shook beneath their feet. She held the boys close as the world outside became a blur of dust and shouting. Through the cracks in the window, she saw flashes of movement, the Apache moving through the chaos like a ghost, the soldiers shouting commands, the captain firing wildly into the smoke. She couldn't tell who was winning, only that everything she had feared was now unfolding in front of her eyes. Then, amid the chaos, she saw the Apache fall to one knee. Her heart seized. She tried to open the door, but one of the boys clung to her arm, crying out for her not to go. She hesitated only a moment before pushing free and running outside. The air was thick with dust. The smell of gunpowder and smoke stung her nose. She stumbled over a fallen horse, her dress torn, her breath ragged. When she reached the field, she saw him on the ground, his hands still clutching the rifle, his chest rising unevenly. She dropped beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to pull him up. "You can't stop now," she whispered. "Not like this." He looked at her through half-open eyes, his voice faint. "You should have stayed inside." "I couldn't," she said, tears streaking through the dust on her face. "You're not alone anymore." But before she could say more, another shot rang out. The captain stood a few yards away, gun in hand, rage and grief twisting his features. "Move," he said hoarsely. "He dies now." The widow rose slowly, standing between them. "You've done enough." The captain's eyes flicked past her, toward the hills where the Apache riders were closing in fast. For the first time, there was fear in his voice. "You think they'll spare you? You've chosen their side?" She didn't flinch. "I chose to see the man instead of the cage." The captain's gun wavered. Behind him, the sound of approaching riders grew louder. The sky darkened with dust, the ground trembling with hooves. The Apache tried to rise, his strength fading. "Go," he whispered. "Get the children." She shook her head. "Not without you." And then, all at once, the sound of the approaching riders broke over them like thunder. The soldiers turned their guns toward the ridge, shouting in panic. The captain cursed, firing into the dust. The widow bent over the Apache, shielding him with her body as arrows whistled past. The world became a blur of sound and motion, shouts, gunfire, hooves, and the roar of chaos swallowing the last bit of peace that land had ever known. The widow clung to him, praying silently that dawn would come again. But deep down she knew the storm had only just reached its heart. The sound of gunfire began to fade as the sun slipped behind the hills. The dust that had filled the air settled slowly, revealing the broken field where soldiers and riders had clashed. The ground was littered with arrows, empty shells, and the echoes of what had just happened. The widow stayed where she was, still holding the Apache in her arms, her breath trembling as the silence grew heavy around them. The battle was over, but the weight of it still hung in the air. From the ridge, a few of the Apache riders descended, their faces marked by grief and exhaustion. They moved carefully, eyes scanning the field for signs of life. The soldiers who had survived had already fled, taking their wounded and leaving their dead. The captain was gone too, though the widow didn't look for him. All she could see was the man lying before her, his chest rising faintly, his skin pale beneath the dust. She pressed her hand against his cheek. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You've come too far to leave now." He opened his eyes slowly, pain flickering in them, but also something softer, something human. "You should go," he murmured. "They won't let me stay." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm not leaving you." One of the Apache riders approached, his expression cautious but not cruel. He was older, his braids streaked with gray. He looked down at the wounded man, then at the widow. "You're the one who freed him?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." The man's gaze lingered on her, studying her face, as if searching for the truth of her heart. Then he looked at the wounded Apache and said something in their language. The words carried weight, but she couldn't understand them. The Apache responded weakly, his voice low but steady. The older man's expression changed grief, mixed with respect. "He says you saved his spirit," the man said softly. "At your mercy." Gave him back what the cage had taken. Her throat tightened. "Then help me save his life." They lifted him together, carrying him toward the cabin. The widow guided them through the doorway, clearing the table so they could lay him down. The boys huddled in the corner, eyes wide and wet. She brushed their hair back gently. "Hush, it's all right now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. For 2 days, the air outside was still. The Apache riders stayed nearby, keeping watch from the hills. The widow worked tirelessly, tending the wounded man with water, herbs, and prayers. Sometimes he drifted into fevered dreams, calling out names she didn't know. Once, he murmured something in his language and reached for her hand. She took it, her fingers trembling as she held on. When he finally woke fully, his eyes found hers. "You should have let me die out there," he said quietly. "I couldn't," she replied. "You didn't let me when you could have." He turned his head toward the window, where the late afternoon light poured in. "I don't belong in this world anymore. Not theirs, not mine." She sat beside him, her voice soft but firm. "Then make your own place in it." "That's what I did." He looked at her for a long time, as if weighing her words against everything he had lost. "You think it's that simple?" "No," she said, "but it's something." That night, the older Apache came to the door. He bowed his head respectfully. "We leave at dawn," he said. "There's one of us, but the soldiers will come again. They will look for him here. If you stay, you will lose everything." The widow glanced at the wounded man. "He can't travel far. Then he stays with us until he can," the man replied. "You gave him his life. We owe you ours." She hesitated. "And if I go with you?" The man studied her for a moment. "Our ways are not yours." "I've lived among ghosts long enough," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I found new ones." Before dawn, she packed what little she had left: a blanket, some bread, a few tools. She left the ringless finger bare, not out of sorrow, but because she no longer needed the symbol. The boys stirred sleepily as she wrapped them in shawls and whispered, "We're going somewhere safer now." When the first light touched the valley, they left the cabin behind. The Apache riders moved silently through the mist, guiding them along narrow trails. The wounded man rode in the middle, his strength returning little by little. The widow walked beside him, steady and quiet. Neither spoke much, but their silence carried a strange peace. Days turned into weeks. The land grew wilder, the air cleaner. The soldiers didn't follow. They had lost too much, and no longer had the will to chase ghosts through the desert. Sometimes at night, the widow would wake to the sound of drums in the distance and wonder if she had crossed into another kind of life entirely. The Apache healed slowly. His scars remained, but the anger that once filled his eyes began to fade. One evening, as the sun burned low across the horizon, he sat beside the widow by the fire. The children slept nearby, curled against each other. "You could go back," he said softly. "Your people would take you in," she smiled faintly. I don't have people anymore. I buried them long ago." He nodded, understanding. "Then stay. Not as mine, not as theirs, just as you are." She looked at him. And for the first time since she had lost her husband, she didn't feel like she was standing in the ruins of something. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something new. The days that followed were quieter. The Apache taught the boys how to track, how to listen to the land. The widow learned to grind herbs for medicine, to mend wounds, to live off what the earth gave freely. The world beyond the hills became a distant memory. But peace, even hard one, never stayed forever. One morning, a scout rode in with word that the army had returned to the valley, burning what they found. The Apache gathered his people, ready to move again. The widow felt the weight of it settle in her chest. "We can't keep running forever," she said. He looked at her, his expression calm. "No, but we can choose where we make our last stand." She didn't argue. That evening, they left the hills behind once more, following the river toward a land the soldiers wouldn't dare cross. The journey was long and harsh, but together they endured it. Each step carried them farther from the cages, the chains, and the past that had once defined them. When they finally reached the valley beyond the mountains, the air was cool and filled with the scent of pine. The widow stopped at the ridge, looking down at the open land below. The Apache stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "This is where we begin again," he said. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. The wind carried them away, soft as whispers. Years later, when travelers passed through that valley, they sometimes spoke of a small settlement hidden among the trees, of a woman with dark braids and calm eyes, of children who spoke to tongues, and of a man who watched the land with the patience of someone who had once seen the world burn and still chosen mercy. They said no one dared harm them, not the soldiers, not the raiders, not even the desert itself. Some called it a legend, others called it a promise. The truth was simpler. It was a story of a woman who had once traded her ring to buy the freedom of a man everyone feared. And in doing so, she found her own. As the sun set over the valley, its light spilling gold across the earth, the widow stood beside the Apache, her hand in his. The world had taken much from them, but it had also given something back, a chance to live not in fear, but in peace. And that in the end was all they had ever wanted.